unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. Indian Genius, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America is a new book by the author and journalist Meenakshi Ahamed. While many immigrant groups have found success in the United States, few have excelled as far and as fast as Indian Americans, reaching heights in a single generation that many thought would take the better part of a century to achieve. Ahmed's new book offers fascinating portraits of several Indian Americans in three distinct sectors: technology, medicine, and public policy. The book tries to understand what exactly accounts for Indian Americans' ability to break into mainstream American culture and their meteoric rise within its ranks. Listeners may remember my 2021 conversation with Meena on her previous book, A Matter of Trust, India-U.S. Relations from Truman to Trump. To talk about her new book, I'm pleased to welcome Meena back to the show. Meena, congrats on the book and welcome back.
Thank you, Milan. It's always a pleasure to be on your show, which I listen to devotedly.
Well, we like to hear that from all of our guests. I actually want to rewind the clock a little bit and back to when we had that conversation a few years ago. Your previous book, A Matter of Trust, was a really exhaustive study of U.S.-India relations, taking us from 1947 to the present day. It followed the story of successive U.S. presidential administrations and how they sort of navigated this relationship between the U.S. and India. I'm wondering, having finished that book, which I know took many years, it was a kind of labor of love, at what point did you decide to sit down, move on, and write this particular book on Indian Americans?
Well, thanks for asking that question. And it's such a pleasure to be on your show because you always ask great questions. So I actually jumped almost straight from that book into this book because when I was writing about the nuclear deal, I began to realize that that is really when Indians found their political voice in America. That was around the time when Indians had established themselves economically and achieved success. And one of the three things, if you remember, that turned the relationship around, one was, of course, the reforms in India that made India emerge as an important economic entity in the world. But the other major thing was that the Indian diaspora had become quite powerful in America and now was pushing to have better U.S.-India relationships, which had been pretty rocky until then. And so when George Bush wanted to pass the nuclear deal, Condi Rice and the Indian ambassador in Washington had called in Indians in America and said, look, we're going to have trouble getting this through Congress and we need your help. And they fanned out and they called their congressmen and senators and they held fundraisers for them and they did all kinds of, they exerted pressure through, the ability to convince them that they could give them votes and money. And they used the system to make it very clear to them they wanted this deal passed. So they played quite a significant, small but significant role in helping with that nuclear deal. So when I was working on that, a sort of little bulb went off, and I thought this is very interesting and deserves being looked into. Now, it took me another couple of years before I had finished the book. And around 2000, when I finished the book, after 2006, I began to look around, and all of a sudden, by the time 2020 came around, Indians were all of a sudden in positions of CEOs, and it wasn't just Indra Nooyi here and Vikram Pandit there. There were really people who were running Fortune 500 companies, Adobe and Satya Nadella's. And so I thought that was a story that needed to be told. So I immediately, after my first book had been published, I began almost immediately to start collecting data and information and looking into the second book. And I began to ask, everyone is interested in this question about how do people become successful? What makes for success? Well, how do they distinguish themselves? And I sort of, the book it's got a provocative title, Indian Genius. And it's not necessarily that each person is a genius. It's sort of like the genius of the Indian people in the way that you talk about American genius or the Jews who are the Jewish genius. But among them, these are very transformative individuals. And so anyway, so I began to look into some of these high-flying people who had begun to have a very major impact on both the economic and cultural landscape in this country.
So, what's interesting about the book is you decided to focus on three sectors in particular. And these are three sectors where you feel Indians have had a kind of disproportionate or perhaps transformational impact, right? And those sectors are technology, science and medicine, and public policy. Now, of course, that does not contain all that Indian Americans have accomplished or done. They've made inroads in a number of other domains. But to reflect a little bit for us on how you ended up with these three categories: tech, medicine, and policy.
Yes, I think that's an important question. Because obviously, every university you go to has so many Indian academic professors and obviously Nobel Prize winners among them. And so there's no question that there are many, many genius level smart people in academia and in the arts. There's the Salman Rushdies, and so there is no question. But what I looked at was what fields have they actually changed the field that they're in? Where have Indians actually transformed the entire sort of field that they have been working in? And where have they attained a height which is truly transformational? So I'll give you an example. Let's take Atul Gawande, the doctor. When Atul Gawande came up, he was a surgeon, very successful, but Atul Gawande was a kind of a visionary. He decided, he came up with this book, The Checklist Manifesto. It was a simple set of procedures that if hospitals followed, they could prevent infections. Now, it began to get adopted by hospitals because he proved, that you could actually bring down infection rates. And once it began to get adopted across the board, it brought infection rates down by something like 60%. So that was pretty transformational. So he wasn't just, achieving success. He was transforming an entire industry. And it wasn't just that it wasn't just one thing that he did. He then came up with a second idea, and his book was titled Being Mortal. And it was about the end of life care. Now, in this country, in the US, 90% of the expenses are in the last 2 years of a person's life. And, healthcare costs are a big topic of discussion in this country. And, he presented everyone with dignity in death and an alternative way of dying. And, you generally, most doctors will admit that, if you have a problem, they don't like to tell you that there isn't a cure. There's always another test. There's always another diagnosis. There's always some medicine that they will try and offer you. But he actually came up with something else. And that book had a major impact across the medical community in this country and began to get adopted by people. So it was a transformative idea. And so, when someone changes an entire industry, an entire field, and begins to change the way people think, I think that to me qualified. That's what I was looking for.
So, Meena, let me just maybe start by asking you about the tech sector. And, I want to start with a name that I don't think a lot of people know. Certainly a lot of people in my generation don't know. I want to ask you about a gentleman by the name of Kanwal Reki. He is referred to as the godfather of the Indian tech community in Silicon Valley. Like I said, his is a name that most people, including many Indians themselves, may not know. Tell us a little bit about who Kanwal is and what role did he play in developing the kind of Indian American ecosystem within Silicon Valley.
So, Kanwal is a very interesting person. He's referred to often as the godfather of Silicon Valley. And, wherever he goes, he's now around in his 80s, but wherever he goes, people sort of almost part ways for him when he comes in. I've I've been in places where people like him and Suhas Patil, where people will come and touch their feet and ask, for their blessings and ask their advice about what their children should do with their lives. I mean, it's really quite sweet. So Kanwal is emblematic of that first generation of Indians that entered the U.S. after 1965, when the U.S. changed its immigration laws. So if you remember, in 1965, actually, I'm not sure you were born then, but in 1965, the U.S. changed their immigration laws and relaxed them. Partly, it was driven out of their own domestic needs. And what were the domestic needs? The domestic needs were, one, Sputnik had happened, and the American military all of a sudden flipped out because they thought the Russians might win the Cold War. So they started investing a massive amount of money into military research and put money into all the universities all across the East Coast and the West Coast. And so, but they realized they didn't have enough engineers. It was the same time when the Vietnam War was sort of escalating. And so a lot of young men had gone off to fight in the Vietnam War. And so there was a real shortage in this country. So what did they do? They went outside the country looking for engineers. And and this is the same thing that happened with doctors. They had a real shortage of doctors. And so they made an exception for people who were skilled. And so they went to places like India, which at that time, with Nehru's very visionary mindset, who believed in science, had invested in those IITs and medical institutes. India was graduating very skilled students. And so it was a perfect match. The push-pull worked out very well. And he was part of those group of Indians that came to America after 1965 to meet that rising desire to have more engineers in this country. Now, when he came, he was actually someone I call the first wave that came, inventors and founders. And part of that was driven out of necessity. They were extremely bright and they worked very hard, but very often they were passed over for management positions. And why were they? Because, Kanwal will tell you, he says, look, I had a thick accent. I didn't know how to dress. He married an American woman, but despite that, he could see that people who were less capable than he was were being given management positions. And so he decided he had invented a precursor of the internet, today's internet. It was pretty remarkable in those days. Everyone's computer, it's hard to imagine now, but computers didn't talk to each other. Computers were all built on different systems. And he had this ability to be able to get computer systems to connect and be able to communicate with each other. And he's the one who devised a way to connect them into a network. So he was quite ahead of his time. Eventually, what did he do? He leaves the company and he starts his own company because he figures that's the only way to get ahead and to be in control of something. And To make a long story short, you can read about it in the book, but his was the first company that got on the stock exchange, and he went public with it. And it's a sort of bittersweet situation because even when he went public, his board insisted that he get a white person from Hewlett Packard to be the CEO instead of him, to take the company public, because they felt that that person would be a better face for the company. So he was quite disgusted by that. But at any rate, he did it because he obviously wanted to sell the company and make the money, and he made a lot of money. After that, he and Suhas Patil, who had started Cirrus Logic, it was the first fabless computer, a sort of precursor to NVIDIA today, which is such a powerful company to those chips. And they all got together and decided to start this group called TICON, the Indus Entrepreneurs. And TI today, it was to help and mentor young Indians and people from other countries as well, young immigrants who didn't have anyone to guide them. And they didn't want them to go through the hardships that they had gone through. And what these people did was they set up an office, and it was really to mentor them. It wasn't to give them money necessarily, but to mentor them and to show them how to run a business, how you get going, how you look for investors, and going from start to finish, and even to tell them whether their ideas were good or bad. And then in the end, some of them then got a group together. They were called angel investors, and they invested in the companies that they thought were worthwhile investing in. And they ended up making almost more money in their investments in these companies than they did in the companies that they sold. So it became very successful. And today, TICON has almost 40 branches all over the world, and it's become huge. I went to a TICON conference, by the way, just 3 weeks ago, because I wanted to see for myself what it was like. And I have to tell you, I was bowled over. I went to one session where they had a professor who was giving them a rundown on how you do a startup. I was riveted. It was not anything that you would get in business school. It was not anything that you'd get, it was a completely different way of thinking. And then after that, they had a table. Each of them had a mentor, and they had 5 kids on each table who was pitching an idea. On my table, there was this incredibly brilliant South Indian woman who had come up with a GPS device of how missiles, it was a GPS device for missiles. She was a physicist. It's beyond my imagination because I'm not that smart, but she had figured out how to stabilize the GPS on these missiles that went beyond a certain mileage into the sky. And her partner was another IIT physicist, engineer who had also a degree from Harvard Business School. These people were absolutely brilliant. And I was wondering, what were they doing here? Why do they even need help from these people? And actually, she had already got an investment from NASA and from the Defense Department, a small, couple of $1 million. And the mentor said to her, "So why do you need TI?" But she wanted TI because she wanted the mentorship of TI. So impressive. There was a guy whose father had worked for the Indian Railways, and he had spent his whole life observing railway lines, and he figured out some device of how to stabilize the railway tracks by just, his childhood going around with his father to all the railway, all over India. So it was, the things that people come up with are quite remarkable. And TI has been a great fostering agent. And Kanwal Rekhi is the one Suhas Patil, and there were 3 or 4 of them that got a group that started it. But Kanwal was part of the global expansion of it. And so he's very much associated with it because he really, after he sold his companies, he actually went and sat there in the offices and would make himself available to everyone.
I mean, it's really it's quite remarkable. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about this book is that you have all of these very interesting, some of them larger than life personalities. I want to just stick with the section on tech for a second and ask you about this exchange you had with a man named Nikesh Arora, who is the CEO of Palo Alto Networks, a relatively well-known business person, one of the highest paid executives in the world. You're talking to him and you make this observation that, the Indian educational system, including the prestigious Indian Institutes of Technology, they're not really known to foster creativity per se. And he has this response, which kind of comes across as a bit of a sharp response. And I just want to quote and then have you reflect on it. He says, "Don't short the Indians who are outstanding executors and have gone on to build the dreams of other people into big, successful businesses. Executors can also have a dream. You can be a creative thinker, but if you can't deliver the dream, it doesn't matter what your dream is." I wonder if that kind of changed your view in terms of your perception of how you kind of saw these kind of, what we call tech bros, but, obviously these kind of tech entrepreneurs.
Well, everyone changed my view. Everyone I interviewed, in a way, changed my views about everything, because you learn so much from each person. You have to be humble. You have to have humility when you go into it. I'm not a tech person. I can barely add 2 + 2. So, my brother's an engineer, but I am not. And I have to tell you that I am very tech challenged. So I had to learn a lot. I read a lot of books, before I went in to speak to people. But despite that, there's no way that you can make up for a lack of your, technical skills. They were so patient. I picked Nikesh because, for one thing, I think cybersecurity is going to be such a critical area of our future because of how much dependence we now have on tech and AI. And Nikesh is a CEO of one of the premier tech company, cybersecurity companies. There's another Indian who is also a founder and CEO of a cybersecurity company. But Nikesh stands out in terms of his risk-taking ability and the way he has worked his way through Google, just the whole industry in general. He knows it well. So I think he's right. I mean, in the sense that, you have these earlier guys who were the founders, Vinod Khosla, who helped found Sun Microsystems. You have Kanwal Rekhi, Suhas Patel. You have a whole bunch of people who, were the early guys. And let's just take Satya Nadella, for example. I mean, Satya Nadella is absolutely visionary. And what Nikesh's point was that if you have a vision, but you don't have the ability to execute, what is the vision? Nobody's going to know what your vision was. And so if you see Microsoft, let's go back to Microsoft and see, after Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, Microsoft had really become a sort of company that was had lost altitude, and it was flailing. And nobody was paying attention to Microsoft. It certainly wasn't on the cutting edge of anything after Bill Gates left. And today, it's probably the most interesting and visionary company around. I think, and it's because of Satya Nadella, because he is an incredible executive, and he has that vision. You just have to see what he's doing with AI, the decisions he's taking. So I think Nikesh is right. I think if you don't have the ability to execute, you have to have both. And so, he definitely, he's a great manager. And he's a thinker, but he's also philosophical. So I like that very much about him.
There's a bit of a kind of sadness, to be honest, that one feels when reading some of your profiles, particularly of successful Indian American women. And I'm thinking specifically of Chandrika Tandon, who is a highly successful businesswoman in her own right, perhaps less well known than her sister, Indra Nooyi, who was the ex-CEO of Pepsi. But when you were talking to Tandon about her life story, she was kind of reflecting on her upbringing, and I just want to read a passage that she narrates to you. And she says, I decided I wanted to attend Madras Christian College. This is when she was a young woman. There were only 4 women in the class, but I applied and was accepted and was determined to go. I faced 2 problems. It was co-ed and an hour away. I had to go on a hunger strike to overcome the family's objections. My mother used to say that when you put fire and cotton together, it's combustible. The implication was that nothing good would come of a co-ed education. Now, there were many other examples of things that her mom had said to her. But, I want to just ask you to reflect a bit on the hurdles that Indian American women, particularly of that generation, had to overcome. Because, frankly speaking, as somebody who studies Indian Americans, these stories seem to get short shrift. But, how representative is Chandrika's story of what you heard, across women of that generation?
So Chandrika is exactly my age. She's my generation. And I think growing up, I was born in 1954. So growing up was a mixed bag. I think that if you, I was fortunate that my parents were very pushy about me getting an education. And I know other people whose parents were pretty progressive about it. But there were many families, many families where really the best thing a girl could do was to marry well. And Chandrika's mother was of the opinion that that's what she should do. And when you think of the amount of talent that was left on the table because of that, it's sort of mind-boggling. And I'm sure even that's true to a degree today, because when you look at the amount of women's participation in the labor force, it's not encouraging in India. So I think, especially as, even amongst the sort of educated people, it's not that encouraging. So I think that, the social, she came from a very conservative Brahmin family in the South, and she had sort of cultural values stacked against her. And it was quite a push for her to try and be able to study and pursue her dreams. There are many people where the preference was given to the boys. When I first came to this country in 1971, it was hard for me to find another woman foreign student. If you're sending your kids abroad, in those days, generally you were going to put your resources into your son, not your daughter. It's just as simple as that.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
I want to pivot here for a second to talking about the fields of science and medicine. And, one of the names which surprised me, I guess it shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, was Deepak Chopra, who is the best-selling author. He's an advocate of alternative medicine. I think for a lot of people in my generation, I'm in my mid-40s, we hear the name Deepak Chopra and we tend to dismiss him as this kind of new agey kind of guru that we might have seen on TV, speaking in this calm, soothing voice. But when you write about him, you say that, look, if there's one person who deserves credit for the transformation and attitudes towards kind of Eastern concepts of healing and medicine and mainstream American culture, it's Deepak Chopra. What is his significance? Tell us why he is so important and why you decided to profile him.
You are not far off in people's reactions and some people's reactions. I myself was a bit of a skeptic. And so I was confronted by, who I was going to pick in the field of medicine. Some of them were very obvious. And then one of my friends, who was a national editor of the Washington Post at the time, said to me, "You have to include Deepak Chopra." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And he described the story, which I thought to me was quite revealing. He said, "Listen," he said, "I was doing a story about drug deals in Virginia." And he described this incident where he was working in a rural area in the hills of Virginia, and he was traveling with this cop who was sort of a redneck Trump supporter type of guy. And he said the guy was constantly complaining about his divorce, his broken marriage, his custody problems, his debt, his mortgage. And then in the middle of driving around and getting towards a drug stakeout, he pops in a Deepak Chopra tape in the middle of this nowhere place. And he said, all of a sudden, the guy zones out and is very calm. And he said, "What happened?" And he said, "How did you find out about Deepak Chopra?" And he said, "Oh man, ever since I came across Deepak Chopra, my whole life has changed." He said, "I get very centered," and he hopes to get through everything. So, the national editor, who was an Indian guy, Rajiv Chandrasekharan, he said to me, Deepak hasn't just influenced people in Beverly Hills and, the rich salons. He said he has helped people in places like this in rural Virginia. He goes across the board. So I began to look into it more. Now, you cannot go down 10 blocks in any street in America, whether, it's Tennessee or whether it's Texas or whether it's, California, without seeing a yoga center or a meditation center. It's become so ubiquitous now. And everyone's grandmother's studying yoga. They're teaching meditation in prisons. They're teaching yoga in high schools. So it's become an American product. And who is responsible? It was Deepak Chopra, because it used to be something that was in the sort of where hippies did it in the 60s. And he's the one, as an endocrinologist, who, as a doctor, after he got onto Oprah Winfrey, he legitimized alternative medicine in this country, particularly yoga and meditation. And so, you have to give him credit. Now, I pride myself on trying to, just because it's my background in history. So I like to read before I go and interview anyone. And with Fareed, I read all his 7 books. And with, Sid Mukherjee, I read all his books. And so I thought I better read books before I go to meet Deepak Chopra. Well, I discovered that Deepak Chopra had written 90 books. There was no way that I was going to be able to read all his 90 books, but I read a few. And basically, look, I'm a Punjabi Hindu, and I was brought up with, some amount of, religion, not a huge amount, but some. And, it's all based on the Bhagavad Gita. a lot of his teachings, a lot of his books, a lot of his philosophy. So, he's kind of modernized it for to make it accessible to a wider audience across the world. But I found him a very kind, very meditative, very philosophical human being who actually wants to help people. So anyway, I think he's been very transformational because in this country, the adaptation at the turn towards alternative health is so transformational. And we have him. He is responsible for that.
Wow. Thank you. That was an incredibly thoughtful answer. I think it maybe makes me and a lot of our listeners kind of reconsider our ill-informed opinion of him. Let me just turn to the third and final domain that you cover, which is kind of public policy. And, when it comes to this question of, it's really about law and public policy, you decided to profile the kind of super lawyer Neil Katyal, and he's somebody who I think a lot of people will recognize from his op-eds in the New York Times, from his many television appearances on MSNBC, from obviously the various high-profile cases he's argued for the Supreme Court. You say that the decision to profile him was an easy one for you, but you were always asked by various people you encountered about the other, quote unquote, well-known Indian American lawyer, Preet Bharara, who of course was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, another well-known author, columnist, podcast host, so on and so forth. Why was Katyal an easy one for you? Why does he deserve his own chapter?
Because Katyal has changed the Constitution. There are not a lot of, look, Preet Bharara is a brilliant lawyer. There's no question about it. And frankly, there are some judges who are Indian who have been pretty brilliant. Some of them who've taken on the Trump cases or ruled on certain Trump cases. But, Preet has done well, and he stood up to Trump in a way by, when he left the Southern District of New York. And he certainly pursued people on Wall Street, as we know, Rajaratnam and Rajat Gupta, and he made a name for himself there and with Cobragade. But he then left. He does a podcast. He's involved in public life. But Neil is actually trying to protect the Constitution, and that is a pretty heavy lift with this administration. I think he has put his career on the line several times. So let me explain. First of all, he's now way past Thurgood Marshall as the minority lawyer that has argued more cases before the Supreme Court. So that in itself is quite a feat. But in the recent Supreme Court case, Moore versus Harper, which was all about whether you could send fake electors. When Trump tried to challenge the 2020 election, and they tried to bring all these lawsuits, which, by the way, they failed at every one. But that ruling put a stop to the politicization of elections by state legislatures.
This was the kind of was around the topic of this quite controversial theory called the independent state legislature theory, right?
Yes.
Which kind of suggests that state legislatures have the sole power to set aside state rules governing congressional elections and basically decide themselves.
Well, his supporters were trying to overturn the results in some states. And so, everyone told him this case wasn't winnable, but he won it in a 6-3 decision in a court dominated by conservative judges. And a conservative judge, Michael Ludwig, who was, on the United States Court of Appeals, he said it was the most important case for American democracy in almost 2.5 centuries since America's founding.
Wow.
So, and Katyal said that had he not won the case, he would have given up practicing law. He said,
wow,
so intensely serious for him. that he was willing to put his career on the line for it. And he said, this was the most significant case of my career because the stakes were astronomical, because it gets to the heart of democracy. If you can have fake electors by state legislatures, which was Trump's theory, then you no longer have checks and balances, and it's not a functioning democracy anymore. So he said that Moore versus Harper is what he had taught and written about and thought about for 20 years. And he said it was the case he was put on earth to do. And before this, he had won this other case, which was Hamdan versus George Bush. That was his first case that made him, he went from being a professor to an activist lawyer. And when in his press statement, he said, this is a country, America's a country where you should and you could expect justice to be dispensed without prejudice. And what he said is what happened today was that a man from Yemen with a fourth grade education, accused of conspiring with one of the most horrendous individuals on the planet, which was Osama bin Laden, was able to sue the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, and have his case heard. That is something that is fundamentally great about America and something that we should all be celebrating to the rest of the world. And no other country would this be possible. And you just have to hope that sentiment and that rule of law is still alive today, because we know that people are trying to gut that.
I mean, we talked about the Chandrakirtan story. I mean, just a shout out to Neil's wife, Joanna, who comes up in your interview when you were kind of like, how do you do all of this, right? And he basically says, look, she's the key to everything. And, the year before the book came out, I guess is when you had the interview. And he said, last year I worked 7 days a week, 14 hours a day for 355 days. He argued 10 major cases in a 10-month span. I mean, that's like a superhuman level of effort, but it didn't come alone. He obviously had this kind of incredible support system. So I just wanted to.
And she, by the way, is a full-time physician.
Right. She's a super achiever in her own right. I want to kind of step back a little bit from these specific examples and domains as we kind of come to the end of this conversation, Meena, and just ask you a little bit about some of the broader lessons, and maybe touch upon, two or three things that come up in the book in various places, but maybe just tease them out a bit more. I want to ask you about the role of caste. This is a very sensitive, touchy subject in our community, as you know. You're very familiar with the scholarly work of Devesh Kapoor and his co-authors, my sometimes co-author, in their book, The Other 1%, which is a fantastic book about Indians in America. They talk about Indians who came to America as being triple selected. And what they mean by that is that you had this pool of largely upper caste Brahmins who had priority access to education. This allowed them to gain entry into prestigious institutions like the IITs and the IIMs. This then allowed them to take advantage of America's skill-based visa regime, right? So they kind of passed through these three filters, and the people who came out the end were really kind of the creme de la creme in a sense. How does caste figure into your narrative? I mean, did you see it prop up? How do you think about this, having done this book?
So, can I just mention that you mentioned Devesh Kapoor's book, The Other 1%, which he co-wrote with two other people. I have to tell you that I would recommend to all your listeners that they should pick up that book, because it was my Bible. I mean, we all stand on the shoulders of others, and honestly, Devesh's work has just been quite uniquely, astoundingly excellent.
And I just want to shout out his co-authors, Sanjay Chakravorty and Nirvikar Singh. It was a joint project. I had the pleasure of attending a workshop, actually, when they presented the first drafts of that book. This was in Philadelphia when Devesh used to run the Center for the Advanced Study of India at UPenn. And you had this feeling as you were reading these chapters of just total excitement, because it was so new, and the data that they had amassed on this community. And as somebody who is Indian American, you were kind of wowed by what they were able to put together. So we'll make sure that we include a link to that in the show notes. But yeah, tell us a little bit of how.
You should put a link to your work at Carnegie with all the data that you have on Indian Americans, because I think that's quite fascinating, all the work that Carnegie is doing on data collection on attitudes of Indian Americans. I think that's fantastic work.
Well, thank you. Well, we will do that too.
On caste. So this is not anything new for Indians, as you well know. Another person who I have a great regard for is Anil Seal. I'm sure Devish would know who he is. Anil Seal was a professor at Cambridge University, and he actually wrote a fascinating book about Indians and caste a long, long time ago. And, about how the British used caste and to sort of further their, to promote what they wanted to accomplish in India. And it was really layering their prejudices and their system and using the Indian caste system to keep things constrained and keep Indians suppressed. And under the British system, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas were given privileges and a certain amount to, I think, the people who were the transcribers and accountants. They were given privileges for education, and others were not. So, remember when India became independent, the illiteracy rates were appalling. I mean, India was basically an illiterate country. I mean, today people think of India producing all the engineers and doctors and, educated people. But when the British left, I think 88% of India was uneducated. And so who had privileges? The privileges were given to the upper castes. 80%, and I think this is probably a statistics that is in Devish's book. Most of the Indians that came to this country certainly were from the upper caste, at least until 2000. And I think that is because they are the ones who had, one, access to education in India and access to connections and privilege in India. You can't just come overseas without anything. I mean, now Kanwal Rekhi, did not come from a wealthy. None of these people came from wealth. Kanwal, Vinod Khosla. But they still had some access. There are all these hidden privileges that people have that aren't actually obvious. And in my book, I've tried to explain this theory a little bit. You see it in, where it looks like you stand before the kings and, you made it all by yourself, but actually you have had help along the way. So people who get into an IIT have to, one, know about it and have to be able to access entrance into the IITs. And in the 1960s, it was unlikely for some kid in a rural village to be able to have that access. But Kanwal Rekhi, even though his father was not wealthy, he was in the military. He had a sort of steady job in one of India's most prestigious institutions. So even though he didn't know much about education, it gave his son the ability to get an education himself and to be able to know about IIT and to be able to apply there and get in. So Kanwal's father didn't know about IIT. He wanted his son to go to the military school. It was his commanding officer who was so impressed because he said his son hadn't gotten into IIT. That's when Kanwal's father realized this was something. But Kanwal, because he'd had an education thanks to the army, he was able to access it. So there are hidden privileges built into belonging to, caste that is not from the bottom.
Let me bring this to a close, Meena, by asking you about the next generation, right? Let's come back to the Chandrika Tandon story, which, so powerful in a way. What's striking about her is that she recognized that she absorbed many of her mother's lessons, but then repeated them with her daughter because she wanted her daughter to really excel in school and so on. At the end of the book, you reflect on the next generation, and you say, and I want to quote here: look at a few spelling bee winners who are now adults. When you do that, it doesn't indicate any unusual talents that resulted from being put under a period of prolonged, intense pressure. These are great achievements, what Indian Americans do in spelling bees and history bees and geographies and math Olympiads and so on and so forth. But there seems to be, something that is missing from just that kind of brute learning alone. What is it, and how would you characterize it?
So I've come across so many Indian parents in India, including members of my own family, where, parents literally sit with their kids doing their homework for hours a day, get them all kinds of tutors. And there are so many parents who think that the only way to progress is for their kids to go to IIT or to get, to take this JEE exam. And it's become ridiculous how much money they spend doing all this. And it's similar to the spelling bee, where this became sort of something that I looked into because I initially thought, shall I do a story on the spelling bee? Because it's such a phenomena that the last 7 spelling bees have been won by Indian children. And it became so ridiculous, the competition, that in the last 2 times, the finalists, there were 8 finalists and they were all Indian. And so I thought, I looked at these. There have been a couple of documentaries, and there have been lots of articles. I mean, I had a file that was so thick about all the information I'd collected, and I began to say, well, how all this effort that the parents make, because they had documented how the parents devise all kinds of, some of the parents are engineers and they produce 200,000 words for the kids to learn, and everyone in the family was involved in teaching the kids, and they were getting tutors in French and tutors in Latin and tutors in Greek for learning, teaching them the derivatives of everything. And I was wondering, where does this lead? Does this lead to the children becoming some sort of genius and achieving some great stuff after, the spelling bee? So I made a matrix for my own information to see, maybe this is a great story. Maybe I should be pursuing this as a book. And I listed out all the winners and some of the finalists, and I by year and everything, and then try to see where they ended up. Now, a lot of them are still young and they haven't, reached their potential. But I tried to see what they ended up doing. And some of them, they became doctors and engineers, but it's not like they went on to win any kind of prizes, or they weren't on some sort of Nobel track or anything like that. They had good careers. I mean, perfectly respectable. It's not that they couldn't have achieved that without being pushed through the spelling bee process. And I began to wonder, what was the point of all this pressure that they put on their kids? After all, every weekend they were doing internal competitions. The Indians now, as a community, have their own competitions within the community of spelling bees before they get to the main national spelling bee. I mean, it's become quite a thing. And so the amount of prep work that these kids have to do before they, every weekend, it's just phenomenal. And I began to wonder, is all this parental pressure, it's just a bit like, what the parents in India do with their kids trying to get into IIT. Where does this lead? Does this actually lead to high achieving kids? Well, the Indian Express did a 6-year study of toppers in India. Then they interviewed all kinds of kids who were at IIT, and they discovered that a lot of them don't want to do engineering, and they actually don't want to be there. They'd rather be doing something else. And they were there because they were fulfilling their parents' dream, not their own. The other remarkable thing I found was that almost every single person that in my book who has achieved, unimaginable success, none of their parents were involved in their decisions or their education. So I thought that was really revealing that, Vinod Khosla and Kanwal Rekhi and all of these people who, I interviewed all said that their parents gave them a whole lot of freedom. No one pushed them to do anything. No one pushed them towards engineering. It was when something clicked with them and they got locked into something they were interested in, that is when they pursued it with their heart and soul and became passionate about it. So, Neil Katyal's mother was, tried to bribe him with a car to become a doctor. And
he wanted, right? He felt pressure to be a doctor. I mean, who among us has not have felt that pressure?
Right. And, he was pressured completely in a different way. I mean, Satya Nadella didn't get into IIT. Neither did Shantanu Narayan. And Shantanu wanted to become a journalist. So it's, I think that there's a lesson there for people who are pushing their children, that maybe that's not the way. If you want your children to become the next Satya Nadella, that's maybe not the way to do it. Maybe let them find their passion instead.
My guest on the show this week is the author and journalist Meenakshi Ahamed. She is the author of the brand new book, Indian Genius, The Meteoric Rise of Indians in America. The historian Michael Beschloss said that Indian Genius is a splendid combination of history, biography, and inspiration. Every American should read and treasure Ahmed's brilliant and captivating new book and learn about the magnificent contributions of Indian Americans. Meena, thank you so much. It was fun to read. We've talked about the book while you were working on it, and so it's nice to see it in its kind of final edition. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.